All right, listeners, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at kind of a strange mix of
Yeah.
sources,
Okay.
all from February 10th, 2025. And we've got a letter from Pope Francis
Right.
that he wrote to the U.S. bishops
Interesting.
addressing migration. We've got one of our favorite political newsletters that's always very snarky and insightful, giving us a rundown of kind of the latest Trump administration craziness. And then,
Oh boy.
just to lighten things up, we've got a news piece from Denmark about this plan to buy California and turn it into
Right.
Beta Denmark.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
So we're going to be covering a lot of ground here. We're going to be talking about everything from immigration to presidential pardons, media manipulation, economic anxieties, and then just a little dash of Scandinavian humor too.
Sounds like a wild ride.
Yeah, buckle up.
I'm ready.
So let's jump right in with Pope Francis. This letter that he wrote to the U.S. bishops, it's not just him, politely expressing concern about immigration policy under the Trump administration. He's bringing in some pretty heavy hitters here. I mean, we're talking Exodus and the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Wow. Okay, so he's not messing around.
No, he's not. So I guess my question for you is, what's the weight of those references? Like, what is he trying to say by invoking those?
Well, I think it's a pretty clear signal that he's trying to frame this issue in a very specific moral context.
Yeah.
You know, bringing up Exodus that draws a really powerful parallel between the Israelites' journey to freedom and the struggles that migrants face today.
Right.
It's a reminder that, we have a moral duty to treat those who are seeking refuge with compassion and respect, regardless of their legal status.
And then
the Good Samaritan parable, that just drives that point home even further.
yeah.
Reminding us that even in a world that's as divided as ours, our responsibility to care for one another extends to everyone, especially the most vulnerable.
He doesn't stop there, though.
Oh,
He takes direct aim at J.D. Vance's concept of Ordo Amoris, which is, essentially this idea that love is ordered, family comes first, then community, and so on. But the Pope seems to be arguing for something much broader.
yeah, he's basically pushing back against that very hierarchical understanding of love, suggesting that true Christian love, it's not about prioritizing just those closest to us,
Yeah.
but expanding our circle of concern to include everyone, especially those that society often pushes to the margins.
It seems like he's directly challenging that us versus them mentality that's become so prevalent, especially in U.S. politics.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important point to highlight,
Especially.
because it's a call for an expansive fraternity that crosses borders and societal divisions.
So, this is a pretty bold statement.
It is.
Especially considering how divisive immigration is in the U.S.
Absolutely.
And, for a lot of American Catholics, their faith is such a huge part of their identity.
Right.
I wonder if this letter could actually cause some serious ripples in the way they view the current political landscape.
Well, I think it's definitely possible. The Pope is a hugely influential figure, especially for devout Catholics.
Right.
So this direct challenge to the policies and rhetoric of the current administration could definitely force some to reevaluate, their political allegiances and priorities.
That makes me think about the 2026 midterms.
Oh, yeah.
Could this letter actually galvanize Catholic voters in a way that we haven't seen before?
It's certainly something to watch.
Yeah, it's definitely a development worth keeping an eye on. Okay, so we've got the Pope weighing in on U.S. politics, but this isn't happening in a vacuum. There's a lot of other stuff going on. So let's move on to our next source, which is this political newsletter that gives us kind of a rapid-fire rundown of the latest Trump-related happenings. And it's a lot.
I bet.
So this newsletter is known for being pretty snarky.
Uh-huh.
So what's got them fired up this time?
Well, it seems President Trump has been very, very busy.
In what way?
We're talking a flurry of firings and pardons. That is just mind-boggling.
Okay, so give me the highlights.
Okay, so first up on the pardon list, we've got some familiar names. Rod Blagojevich,
Oh, wow.
the former Illinois governor, remember him, tried to sell Obama's vacant Senate seat.
Right.
Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, had those corruption charges mysteriously dropped by the Justice Department.
Very convenient.
Very convenient.
Yeah.
And then on the firing side of things, it gets even more chaotic. Members of the Kennedy Center board are being replaced.
Really?
FBI probationary employees are being targeted. Military academy boards are getting the axes. The archivist of the United States has been dismissed. And even the director of the Office of Government Ethics got temporarily fired. It's like a purge, but it's hard to see a clear pattern here.
Yeah, it sounds less like good governance and more like chaos.
Yeah, a little bit.
But, is there a method to this madness?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Some argue that what we're seeing here is all about consolidating power. rewarding unwavering loyalty while simultaneously eliminating anyone who might question or challenge his authority.
So it's kind of like he's creating an echo chamber.
It's exactly where dissent is swiftly silenced.
That's a little chilling. So, I mean, if we're trying to connect this to the bigger picture that we're seeing, it seems like there's a bit of a pattern emerging here. First, we have the Pope basically calling out this moral imperative that directly contradicts the administration's actions.
Yeah.
And now we see these pardons and firings that seem less about justice and more about control. It makes you wonder what the long-term consequences are going to be for, the rule of law and democratic norms.
Absolutely. It raises serious questions about the future of checks and balances in the U.S.
It's like we're watching the dismantling of these institutions that were specifically designed to hold power accountable.
I got it. And speaking of attempts to control the narrative, let's move on to something a bit lighter, at least on the surface.
Okay.
Remember those 27 words the NSA was trying to ban?
Oh, yeah, the war on woke language. It seems almost comical. Like they think they can erase social issues by just eliminating certain terms.
It's like playing linguistic whack-a-mole.
Linguistic whack-a-mole. I love that.
Right, where concepts like diversity, equity, and inclusion are suddenly these dangerous moles that need to be whacked down.
So what are they so afraid of?
Right. What happens when language itself becomes this battleground?
And what's a real target here? Is it just language? Or is this about something bigger?
Well, some argue that this is a way to stifle dissent and control the narrative around important social issues.
By framing certain words and ideas as, dangerous or unacceptable, they can basically shut down entire conversations.
Exactly, and limit the scope of public discourse.
It's a way to control the terms of the debate.
Yes.
And ultimately influence how people think and talk about these issues. Like they're trying to create a world where certain perspectives just aren't allowed to exist.
Right.
And while we're on the topic of things that seem a little absurd,
okay,
can we talk about the Trump administration's vendetta against paper straws?
Oh, absolutely. This is where things take a truly bizarre turn.
Yeah.
It's almost comical how fixated they seem on this issue.
Yeah.
Especially when you compare it to the much more serious attempts to control information and shape public discourse that we've been talking about.
It's like they're fiddling while Rome burns.
Right.
But instead of a fiddle, it's a plastic straw.
Exactly.
It's this perfect example of how they're focusing on these symbolic gestures.
Yes.
And these manufactured controversies to distract from the real problems facing the country. While they're busy banning paper straws and purging woke language, the national debt continues to climb, climate change accelerates, and economic inequality widens.
It's all about misdirection.
Yeah.
Creating this illusion of action.
Right.
While failing to address the root causes of these very real issues.
And this is where things start to feel a bit Orwellian.
Yes.
It's not just about controlling actions, it's about controlling thoughts, language, and even the way we experience the world around us.
Absolutely.
Which leads us to our next point.
Okay.
This increasingly blurred line between the Trump administration and right-wing media outlets like Fox News. I mean, you've got the hiring of Laura Trump by Fox News.
Right.
And then the preferential treatment that's given to certain conservative publications by the Pentagon. That raises some serious red flags.
Absolutely. What we're witnessing is the creation of this parallel media ecosystem.
Right.
One that operates in service of the Trump administration's agenda.
Yeah.
And reinforces its narrative.
Undermining trust in more traditional media sources.
Exactly. And creating an environment that's ripe for propaganda and misinformation.
It's like they're trying to build their own reality.
Yeah.
One where facts are malleable.
Right.
And dissent is silenced.
Absolutely.
And this control over information becomes even more concerning when you consider the economic anxieties that are bubbling beneath the surface.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, Trump talks a big game about, tariffs and trade deficits, but everyday Americans are feeling the pinch.
Yes, they are.
With the rising cost of living.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to another crucial point here. All of this political maneuvering and media manipulation that we've been discussing, it's happening against a backdrop of very real economic hardship for a lot of Americans.
Right.
The rising cost of everyday items. I mean, even just something like eggs. It's a stark reminder that these aren't just abstract political debates.
Right.
They have very tangible consequences for people's lives.
So we've got this really complex picture emerging here. Right. We've got these global forces at play. The Pope calling for compassion on the world stage, the U.S. grappling with these internal divisions.
Right.
And then we've got this curious news from Denmark about buying California.
Yeah.
It feels almost like this whimsical escape from the chaos.
It does. It's a fascinating juxtaposition.
Yeah.
On one hand, we have these very real anxieties and power struggles playing out in the U.S.,
Right.
and on the other, we have this lighthearted, almost utopian vision of a California that's transformed into this haven
Yeah.
of Danish hedge and social democracy.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what the Danes see that maybe we're missing. Maybe they're onto something with this focus on well-being, sustainability, and a more collaborative approach to politics.
It almost feels like a gentle critique of the American way of doing things.
Right. It definitely raises some thought-provoking questions.
It does.
Like, what would a new Denmark in California actually look like?
Yeah.
Would it be this utopia?
Right.
Or would it face its own unique set of challenges?
Right. And what does this tell us about how the rest of the world views America?
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From papal pronouncements and presidential pardons to linguistic battles and economic anxieties, with a dash of Scandinavian humor thrown in for good measure.
A lot to digest.
It is. So before we dive into the Danish campaign to buy California and turn it into New Denmark, let's just pause for a second and see if there are any key takeaways that stand out to you so far.
Yeah, I think the most striking thing for me is the interconnectedness of all these seemingly disparate events.
Yeah.
You know, the Pope's letter, the Trump administration's actions, the economic anxieties, and even the Danish satire.
Right.
They all speak to this deeper sense of unease and uncertainty about the future.
Yeah.
It's like we're at a crossroads facing some really fundamental questions about our values, our identity, and the kind of society you want to create.
I totally agree. It's like we're watching a play unfold, and each of these events is a scene
Right.
that contributes to the overall narrative.
Exactly.
And it's complex, it's messy, and it's definitely keeping us on the edge of our seats.
Absolutely. And it's far from over. Who knows what twists and turns lie ahead?
Well, that's a perfect segue to our next topic, because things are about to get very interesting. Get ready to journey with us to a world where California is no longer the Golden State, but New Denmark.
Pass the pastries, please. This is going to be a fascinating ride.
Buckle up. It's going to be a wild one.
So you want to trade Hollywood for Hans Christian Andersen land? This Danish campaign to buy California and turn it into New Denmark.
I know, right? It's certainly creative.
It is.
But on a more serious note, I gotta admit, the idea of California becoming, this haven of hygge with bike lanes galore and maybe even a Hans Christian Andersen theme park is kind of appealing. But I guess let's unpack this a bit. What's the real message behind this seemingly lighthearted campaign?
Well, I think it's more than just a whimsical idea.
Yeah.
This campaign is cleverly using satire to highlight the stark contrast between Danish and American values.
So they're basically holding up a mirror to American society.
Exactly. And maybe not everyone will like what they see.
So what aspects of American culture do you think this campaign is specifically satirizing?
Well, it's hard to miss the jab at America's obsession with consumerism.
Yeah.
Yeah, the campaign jokingly mentions replacing avocado toast with pastries.
Mm-hmm.
It's a playful dig at the perceived excesses of American culture. But beyond that, I think it's a critique of this deep-seated individualism that often trumps collective well-being in the U.S.
Right. The Danish emphasis on community and social responsibility is pretty much the opposite of that every man for himself attitude that sometimes prevails in American politics. But let's get real for a second. Do you think this campaign is actually resonating with Americans? Could there be a genuine desire for a more Danish way of life?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think the campaign's popularity definitely speaks to a certain level of disillusionment with the current state of affairs in the U.S.
Yeah.
People are tired of the political gridlock, the social divisions, the economic anxieties. They're looking for alternatives, even if those alternatives seem far-fetched or satirical.
Right. It's like they're saying, hey, America, maybe there's a better way. But California, with its size and complexity, it's hardly a blank slate. So could a new Denmark actually work there? What challenges might they face?
You're right. California is like a microcosm of the U.S. It has its own unique set of challenges. And let's not forget, the New Denmark campaign is ultimately satire. It's not a blueprint for political change. But even if it's not a realistic proposal, it forces us to think outside the box. Consider what kind of society we want to create. What if we prioritized well-being and sustainability over consumerism and individualism? What if we embraced a more collaborative approach to politics?
It's a thought-provoking exercise for sure. But let's shift gears for a moment and go back to something we touched on earlier. These economic anxieties that are fueling so much of the political and social unrest in the U.S. It's easy to get caught up in the political theatrics and the cultural debates, but we can't ignore the real-world consequences for everyday Americans.
Absolutely. While the New Denmark campaign satirizes avocado toast, it also touches upon a very real issue,
Which is?
the rising cost of living,
Yeah.
particularly for essential goods. And this is where the Trump administration's focus on distractions and scapegoats becomes particularly dangerous.
How so?
Instead of addressing the root causes of economic inequality and inflation, they're busy blaming immigrants, woke language, even paper straws.
It's like a magician's sleight of hand, diverting attention away from the real problems while pretending to be doing something.
Exactly. And meanwhile, the national debt keeps soaring, trade deficits persist, and ordinary Americans are struggling to make ends meet.
Do you think this economic anxiety is playing into the hands of populist leaders like Trump?
Without a doubt, economic hardship creates fertile ground for divisive rhetoric and simplistic solutions.
Right.
By stoking fear and resentment, leaders like Trump can deflect blame for their own policies and failures and rally their base around this shared sense of grievance.
It's a dangerous game,
It is.
one that exploits people's legitimate concerns for political gain. But let's delve into another aspect of the Trump administration's approach that's been raising eyebrows, this blurring of lines between government and media. We've already mentioned Fox News hiring Lara Trump and the Pentagon showing favoritism towards certain conservative outlets. What's the bigger picture here?
What we're witnessing is a deliberate attempt to create a parallel media ecosystem that operates in service of the Trump administration's agenda. It's not just about friendly faces on Fox News. It's about controlling the flow of information and shaping public perception.
It's like they're trying to build a fortress of information where only approved narratives are allowed to penetrate. What are the implications of this for freedom of the press and the public's right to know?
The consequences are potentially devastating. By discrediting and silencing critical voices, they create an environment where propaganda and misinformation thrive. This erosion of trust in traditional media sources, it's a hallmark of authoritarian regimes.
Yeah.
And it's deeply concerning to see such tactics being deployed in the U.S.
It's a reminder that freedom of the press isn't a given.
It's not.
It's a right that must be constantly defended against those who seek to undermine it for their own gain. And speaking of control, let's circle back to the war on woke language. It might seem trivial compared to some of the other issues we've discussed, but I think it's actually quite revealing.
I agree. It's a window into how language is being weaponized to create division and demonize certain groups. By labeling words and concepts as woke, they're trying to delegitimize entire fields of study social movements, even basic human rights.
It's like they're trying to rewrite the dictionary to fit their own narrow worldview. But what's the end game here? Is it simply about controlling language? Or is there a deeper agenda at play?
I think it's about more than just words. It's about shaping the way people think and talk about complex issues. By framing certain ideas as dangerous or unacceptable, they can stifle dissent and limit the scope of public discourse.
Right.
It's a form of thought control, and it's incredibly dangerous.
It's a chilling thought, and one that raises some uncomfortable questions about the future of free speech and open debate in the U.S. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s appointment as the head of the Department of Health and Human Services. His stance on vaccines has been a subject of controversy, and his credit card debt raises concerns about potential conflicts of interest.
You're right. It's a situation that warrants close scrutiny. Kennedy's views on vaccines are well documented, and they put him at odds with the scientific consensus on the safety and efficacy of vaccines.
Right.
This raises legitimate concerns about how his personal beliefs might influence his decisions as the head of a crucial health agency.
And his significant credit card debt also raises red flags. Some argue that this level of personal debt could make him vulnerable to undue influence from those seeking to advance their own agendas within the department. It's a situation that demands transparency and accountability.
Absolutely. We need to know if there are any external factors that could compromise his ability to make impartial decisions based on scientific evidence and the best interests of public health.
Right.
This isn't about personal attacks. It's about ensuring that those in positions of power are acting with integrity and in the public's best interest.
It's a reminder that we must hold those in power accountable regardless of their political affiliations or personal beliefs. Speaking of holding people accountable, how does the potential for corruption play into all of this?
Well, corruption thrives in the shadows. When transparency is lacking and accountability is weak, it creates opportunities for those in power to abuse their positions for personal gain. The situation with Kennedy's debt raises legitimate questions about whether he might be susceptible to such pressures.
It's like a crack in the foundation of trust.
Yeah.
And once that crack appears, it can be difficult to repair.
It can.
We need to be vigilant and demand transparency, not just from those in power, but from the systems that are supposed to hold them accountable.
Exactly. And this is where a free and independent press plays such a crucial role. By shining a light on potential conflicts of interest and holding those in power accountable, the media can help to safeguard against corruption and ensure that decisions are being made in the public interest. But as we discussed earlier, the Trump administration's efforts to control the media and discredit critical voices make this task even more challenging.
It's like a battle for truth and transparency is being waged, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The future of our democracy might very well depend on the outcome. But amidst all this talk of corruption and power struggles, let's not forget the power of satire and humor.
Ah, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's return to our Danish friends and their whimsical plan to buy California. It's a reminder that even in the face of adversity, a little bit of laughter can go a long way.
It's like a breath of fresh air, a reminder that there are other ways of seeing the world, other possibilities to explore, and who knows, maybe there's a little bit of new Denmark in all of us just waiting to be unleashed. But that's conversation for another time. For now, let's dive back into the complexities of American politics and culture and see what other insights we can uncover. It's wild, right? As we're going through all of this, the political maneuvering, the economic anxieties, the attempts to control the narrative, it's like this Danish campaign to buy California and infuse it with their own cultural flavor feels like the splash of cold water on a hot day.
I know, it's refreshing. It's a reminder that even in the midst of all the chaos and uncertainty, there's still room for humor and imagination.
Yeah.
And the New Denmark campaign, while obviously satirical, it sparks this really intriguing question. What if we could reimagine the American dream, borrowing ideas from other cultures that seem to prioritize well-being and the social harmony?
Right. Like they're holding up a mirror to American society and being like, hey, maybe there's another way.
Exactly.
But it's not just about importing Danish culture wholesale, is it?
No.
It's about identifying the values that underpin their approach.
Right.
Things like community sustainability, a willingness to work together, and seeing if those values could be adapted to fit the American context.
I think that's a key point.
Mm-hmm.
The New Denmark campaign is less about turning California into a carbon copy of Denmark and more about prompting a conversation about what kind of society we want to build. It challenges us to think beyond the current political and cultural divides and imagine a future where cooperation, empathy, and a genuine concern for the well-being of all citizens are paramount.
And that brings me back to something we discussed earlier, the Pope's letter to the U.S. bishops.
Okay.
There's a fascinating parallel there, isn't there?
Yeah, I see it.
Both the Pope and this satirical Danish campaign in their own ways are calling for a more expansive and inclusive understanding of community and responsibility.
Right.
They're challenging that us versus them mentality that seems to be driving so much of the political and social discourse in the U.S. right now.
It's true. There's this shared thread running through these seemingly disparate events.
Yeah.
There's this idea that we're all interconnected, that our actions have consequences for others, and that true progress can only be achieved through cooperation and a willingness to extend our circle of concern beyond our immediate tribe. It's a powerful message and one that I think resonates deeply with a lot of people, regardless of their political beliefs or cultural background.
Yeah. It taps into this yearning for a more just and equitable society, a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, not just a select few. But how do we bridge the gap between this idealistic vision and the messy realities of American politics and culture?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's easy to get swept up in the rhetoric and the grand pronouncements. But real change happens on the ground in our communities and our daily interactions.
So what can we do?
It's about engaging in those difficult conversations, challenging our own assumptions, and being willing to listen to perspectives that differ from our own.
It's about recognizing that we're all part of the solution and that even small acts of kindness, compassion, and understanding can have a ripple effect. It's about choosing to build bridges rather than walls.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, even amidst all the challenges we face, there's always room for hope and humor. That's what makes this Danish campaign so brilliant. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, we can still find moments of levity and inspiration.
It's like a wink and a nudge, a gentle reminder that sometimes the best way to confront difficult issues is with a touch of wit and a dash of irreverence. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of U.S. politics and culture, we leave you with this thought. Don't underestimate the power of laughter, imagination, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. The future might just depend on it.
And never stop asking questions. Curiosity is the key that unlocks understanding.
Exactly. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible. That's what the deep dive is all about. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep diving.